September 1985. The wreck of the RMS Titanic is located deep within the Atlantic Ocean. Hurricane Elena devastates the Gulf Coast, causing over $1 billion in damage. An 8.0 magnitude earthquake kills thousands of people in Mexico City. These are all massively historically significant events, but it could be argued that one occurrence in September 1985 has overshadowed them all in the ensuing decades. Super Mario Bros. Released on September 13th, 1985, changed video games and the world forever. May 5th, 1818, another seminal icon is released which will change the world forever. Karl Marx. Marx, Mario, Mario, Marx. This is a video about Marxism and Super Mario Bros. Finally, the intro's finished and we can get on with this friggin' video essay about Marxism and Mario. Now, before we can talk about Super Mario Bros., we have to first thoroughly explain the very nature of reality itself. Marxist philosophy is rooted in materialism, which is a belief that the material world is the first basis of existence. According to materialists, all things, including human consciousness, arise from material interactions. The opposite of materialism is idealism, which is a belief that human consciousness is the first basis of reality, which directs all human development, and which is wrong. Early materialists believed that human consciousness was simply a mechanical result of material processes. They thought that our thoughts were simply generated by the material processes of the human brain as a sort of byproduct, and that the experience that we call consciousness was essentially an illusion that makes us believe that our spirit or consciousness is in control when it's really all those little atoms and electrons whizzing around in our noggins that exclusively decide everything we do, say, and believe. But Karl Marx, along with his bro from another Mo, Friedrich Engels, revolutionized materialism by developing it into dialectical materialism. Now, you could think of dialectical as a fancy way of saying that things affect each other mutually. When I change you, you change me. Dialectics changed the game of materialism by positing that while matter determines consciousness, consciousness also mutually impacts the material world through our human will and labor. So this dialectical interaction between matter and consciousness works in both directions. In fact, Marx and Engels argued that it was this kind of dialectical process that created consciousness to begin with. The evolution of human beings was a complicated process that took thousands of years, but according to Marx and Engels, the principal ingredients were the social activities of language and labor. See, as humans struggle with nature, we struggle together. Working together, we begin to develop tools. But the tools themselves also developed us. See, the more we came to rely on tools, the more our bodies evolved to accommodate tool use. The hand shaped the hammer, yes, but the hammer also shaped the hand. There's a Hammer Brothers joke in there somewhere, but I'm grasping, I can't find it. Friedrich Engels explained that it took a really long time before human hands evolved enough to create the first knives and other simple tools. But once this finally did evolve through the use of more primitive tools, it gave humans an evolutionary advantage. The hand had become free and could henceforth attain ever greater dexterity. The greater flexibility thus acquired was inherited and increased from generation to generation. Thus, the hand is not only the organ of labor, it is also the product of labor. The same is true for language. Language developed to facilitate collective labor and other social activities with our fellow humans. The more complex our social activities became over time, the more complex our brains physically developed in the material world to accommodate human language, and the more complex our thought processes could thus become. Our brains developed language, and language developed our brains. It was all very dialectical. As Marx and Engels explained in the German ideology, consciousness is therefore from the very beginning a social product and remains so as long as men exist at all. Another way to look at the development of consciousness is through the process of reflection. In Marxism, reflection is what happens whenever two things mutually impact each other. Reflection has evolved over time as materials have become more complex in their systemic arrangement. The most basic form of reflection is physical reflection. Whenever two things smash into each other, they leave impacts on each other, which is a very basic form of reflection. There's also chemical reflection, which occurs whenever two substances chemically interact. The substances swap atoms and molecules around and impact each other mutually. Basically, it's impossible for one thing to change another thing physically without being changed itself in some way. The changes are always mutual, and these mutual changes we call reflections. As life evolved, a more complex form of reflection emerged, biological reflection. When living things encounter certain stimuli, they automatically react. And these kinds of natural reflexes are biological reflections of the external material world. By the time organisms developed central nervous systems, a new, even more advanced stage of reflection emerged: mental reflection. Mental reflections are conditioned reflex responses that occur when animals learn to react to their environments over time. It takes a little bit of a more complicated brain to do this. With mental reflection, animals began to develop the earliest forms of consciousness, which made it possible to reflect the external world in the mind through learning. As the human brain evolved, the highest form of reflection also emerged: dynamic and creative reflection. This form of reflection allows human beings to process and understand the meaning of information itself. We call this dynamic and creative reflection consciousness. So consciousness is a form of reflection of the material world. Now, as Marx explains in the German ideology, all conscious thought stems from physical life processes through the process of dynamic and creative reflection. Ideas are produced as humans go through our daily activities in the material world. Those ideas are essentially spawned from the material world and our interactions with it. Our ideas are directly interwoven with our material activity and labor. There's no such thing as a pure idea that's completely isolated from the material world. As Marx puts it, consciousness can never be anything else than conscious existence, and the existence of men is their actual life process. Marx and Engels describe consciousness as a reflection of the material world, not an exact copy, mind you. We don't see the world exactly as a mirror of what it is, but we see it as a reflection. That is what consciousness is, a reflection of the material world. Human consciousness has, thus, a dialectical relationship with the material world. Now, although Super Mario Bros. Seems a little simple and quaint by today's standards, it was groundbreaking in its day and age. The game was developed by a talented team of artists and technicians using tools and techniques that are primitive by today's standards. There were a lot of physical limitations on what could be done in the game. The lead designer of the team, Shigeru Miyamoto, had ambitions for a game which just couldn't be realized with the technology of the time. Originally, for example, he wanted to give Mario the ability to ride a dinosaur, but this just couldn't be accomplished with the basic hardware they had to work with at the time. This brings us to the concept of content and form. In Marxism, content can be thought of as what something is made of, and form can be thought of the shape which content takes. For example, this object has the form of a table and the content of wood and nails. This painting has the form of a bird and the content of paint and canvas. Content and form have a dialectical relationship with each other. Content determines form, but form can also impact content. For example, if you want to make a table and all you have available are wooden nails, as any Minecraft player will tell you, then that will essentially determine the form that the table ends up taking. If all you have is wood, then you are going to end up with a wooden table, and it will have to have certain characteristics of form. When content changes, the form must change accordingly. If instead of wood you have iron, then the table you end up building will have a much different form. It will have an iron table form. There's no way to make an iron table if all you have as content is wood. Now again, form can influence the content, but not nearly as much as content determines form. Like, if you have a bunch of wood and nails, but you develop a technique for building a nice table that doesn't need any nails, then that would be an example of a change in form reflecting a change in content. Sort of. But yeah, for the most part, content has way more impact on form, and that was certainly the case with Super Mario Bros. The game was planned to be the final exclamation point for the ROM cartridge format used at the time for Nintendo games, and the development team had a great deal of experience wrenching as much performance as possible from that highly limited technology. Programmers used a variety of special knowledge, tricks, and techniques to create a game that offered a fun, responsive, and expansive experience by the standards of the day. And that's what we call Super Mario Bros. In Marxist terms, the ROM cartridges were the content. And even though the game dev team worked brilliantly and tirelessly to push the envelope on that tech, there were hard limitations on what could be accomplished. So, sorry Mario, you don't get to ride a dinosaur, at least not in September of 1985. Nintendo would of course go on to develop more advanced technology, which was used in video game hardware that eventually allowed Mario to finally get to ride a dinosaur 5 years later in Super Mario World, which is, in a way, a dialectical process of content dictating form over time through human labor activities. The game designers at Nintendo wanted to make more technically complicated games, which went beyond the limitations of the ROM cartridge content, which meant that newer and better types of technology had to be developed to accommodate the cooler form, the cooler games that Nintendo wanted to make, and thus Mario marched on dialectically right up until this very day.
As I'm sitting here editing this, I'm starting to realize that all this stuff about content and form probably sounds kind of esoteric and useless, but knowing this dialectical relationship between content and form has all sorts of real-world applications. It's actually very useful information. For one thing, it's important to understand that content dictates form, so we can pick content that best matches the form we want to achieve. I have to think about this all the time as a content creator, like what's the best way to deliver certain pieces of information so that the form will be as good as possible. You know, you have to make sure that the content matches the form. Sometimes it's better to discuss certain topics in a live stream. Sometimes it's better to make a video. Sometimes I just need to make a YouTube community post, whatever. There's some ideas that I really want to do, but I just haven't been able to do them yet because I don't have a suitable platform. I don't have the right content to really pull the form in my head off. And also, Marx's analysis of capitalism was revolutionary because he was able to understand nuances of content and form that other economists of his day missed. Specifically, he was able to see how different forms of value interacted with each other, especially the money form of value, and he knew all the ramifications that had in the system of capitalism, which was crucial to his critique in Das Kapital. There's a lot more to this, but for now, just try to keep in mind that content and form should be suitable with each other. Otherwise, you'll end up like Michael Scott from The Office, whose big problem in life seems to be a complete inability to match content with form.
Depression is a very serious illness. Over 32,000 people commit suicide every year, according to a 2004 study.
Is that the last year that data was available?
Yes.
Super Mario Bros. Is a video game, believe it or not, and video games are pretty friggin' interesting from a philosophical perspective. They are essentially virtual worlds, which are reflections of the material world which we live in. Just like our material world, Super Mario Bros. Has objects and physics and laws which govern motion. There's even a sort of very primitive life in Super Mario Bros. Koopa Troopas and Goombas and Piranha Plants all react reflexively to stimuli in a crude but somewhat convincing form of virtualized biological reflection. Of course, this whole virtual world doesn't directly reflect the material world. That is to say, it didn't just pop into physical existence through purely mechanical material processes. Human beings had to create this world through their consciousness. The dev team had to plan and program this game and bring it into the world through human will and labor. In that sense, Super Mario Bros. Is a reflection of the human consciousness of those human creators. Human beings had to conceive of every sprite, every rule, every line of code that composes the game. And the consciousness of each of those humans was itself a reflection of the material world which determines human consciousness. So fascinatingly, the virtual world of Super Mario Bros. Is a reflection of a reflection of a reflection, a ghostly trace of the material world which we inhabit, transmuted through the processes of consciousness which occurred decades ago within the physical brains of a team of Japanese video game developers and concretely determined by the formal limitations of 1980s computer chips. And all of those processes of consciousness which occurred over 30 years ago are embedded in computer chips and software files that we can still access today. It's pretty awesome. Whenever a human being plays Super Mario Bros., our consciousness becomes reflected into the virtual world of the game itself through the mechanical motions of our thumbs on the control pad. Whenever your brain wills Mario to jump, it sends a signal that goes through the nervous system that prods your thumb to push a button that sends an electrical signal to the game cartridge which makes Mario jump in the virtual world. This is reflected back to you through the electronic processes of the screen, the waves of light that hit the photochemical receptors of your human eyes, which send electrical signals to your brain, which signals to your consciousness that Mario has jumped. A miraculous cascading of reflections upon reflections which span electrons, flesh, and consciousness in the merest fraction of a second. It's a remarkable thing, and over the years, human beings have honed this process of reflective feedback looping into marvelous accomplishments that boggle the mind. I'm talking, of course, about speedrunners who have been able to progressively shave down the total amount of time it takes to beat all 8 worlds of Super Mario Bros. to, at the time of recording, a mere 4 minutes and 54.948 seconds. Okay, I think that's with warps, but regardless, that's pretty damn impressive.
Oh my God! Yes!
This amazing achievement of mind and matter pushes the capabilities of human consciousness to the very limits. Speedrunners have to practice for hundreds and hundreds of hours to make world records. And the process of shaving off just 1 microsecond is typically a painstaking treadmill of practice, practice, and more practice. And when I say practice, I mean practice in the Marxist sense. You see, Marx and Engels believe that the best way to develop our understanding and mastery of the material world is through practice, through practical human activity and observation. Only systematic exercise and observation within and of the material world will enable human beings to better understand and more reliably tame the material world. Engels wrote that practice, experiment, and industry were the key to bringing the material world under our control and making it serve our own purposes. Marxist practice is thus, in essence, the work of science, forming a hypothesis and then testing it against reality in an organized, systematic way. Speedrunners show the power of practice. They tirelessly experiment and improve their mastery of the material processes of Super Mario Bros. And other video games through an endless procession of tweaks and improvements that constitute practice. Whether they realize it or not, speedrunners are dialectical materialists. They are engaging in a dialectical materialist process of practice. They have to be if they want to make progress and beat records. They have to understand the intertwining of consciousness and matter if they want to meet their goals in speedrunning. And there is no place in speedrunning for idealism. Speedrunners have to know that they can't just dictate material reality through thought alone. It doesn't matter how much you believe that you can dominate reality through will alone. You can't think your way to the top in speedrunning without a material engagement of practice. You can't debate and argue your way to a top record. Your ideas have to align with reality, or else you're gonna be in deep Koopa Troopa poop, sonny boy. You know, it would be ideal if Mario could jump slightly higher so I could save time on this level. Nobody cares about your damn ideal in Mario speedrunning, Buster. Material conditions will determine your options, unless you have a Game Genie, I suppose. But guess what? Game Genies change the material conditions of the game, so booyah, suck it, you idealist piece of shit. If you don't physically push that button at precisely the right time and in exactly the right location, then you're gonna lose a frame, and that's gonna cost you a record, baby. Speedrunners have to operate on the basis, whether they realize it or not, that mind can only impact matter up to a certain extent, and that to push the limits and snag that top spot on the leaderboard, you gotta understand the material determiners of reality and the precise ways in which consciousness can impact the material world through the dialectical process of smashing those buttons. Of course, speedrunners aren't typically Marxists, and they don't have to be, because significantly, these principles apply whether we're conscious of them or not. They have applied for all of eternity, at least for as long as consciousness has existed. And you know, we're really just scratching on the surface of the complexities of Marxist philosophy, but I want to make this video short so more people will watch it. But if you want to learn more, I did put some links in the description to some other videos you might enjoy. And someday soon, I'll make a video about the Marxist conception of essence and phenomenon as they pertain to Super Mario Bros. 2. So if you want to see that, be sure to will your finger to reflect your consciousness into the material world by smashing that subscribe button, click like, leave a comment below answering the question, is Mario a working class folk hero or a willing pawn of the mushroom monarchy? For now, I'm EJ, this is NonCompete. Game over.
Two of the baddest of the bad guys are the Hammer Brothers, but you can outwit them.
When you're in level 3-1, there's going to be a spot about halfway through where you're going to run into the Hammer Brothers. Head to the right a little bit. There's going to be 2 sets of 3 bricks. right on top of each other. Hit the brick on the right-hand side, and a beanstalk will appear. You'll end up in the sky world, and you can collect a whole ton of coins. Stage 3-1. Towards the end of the stage, there's going to be a large staircase. Bypass the first hurdle. On the second one, jump up towards the left-hand side of him, land on him, and continue to jump up and down. That's the way to get 99 free men on Super Mario Brothers, and a whole lot of points.
Once again, I asked, who are Mario and Luigi? And this time I was told that they are us, the best of what's really inside each of us.
They're the nice guys, and the guys who are suddenly thrown into this fantasy world where they've got the ultimate challenge ahead of themselves. Can they rescue a princess? Can they save the world? And that's all of us.
All of this is beyond me. I had trouble with Lincoln Logs. Remember Lincoln Logs? I mean, that was it for me.